Okay, well, firstly, could you introduce yourself and tell me the organisation you represent?
I'm Belynda Petrie, and I'm CEO of One World Sustainable Investments, which is based in South Africa and operates across sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, and what we've seen here at the conference so far is many, many organisations working in many different fields. Your aim, as I understand it, is to try to link these organisations together, make sure they're talking to one another. Is that correct?
More or less. We focus very much on linking climate change experts with policymakers and with implementers of responses to climate change, so that there's a coherent, what we would call a science policy institutional dialogue going all the time.
Right. Was that something that was lacking in the past?
Yes, and it probably still is lacking. I wouldn't say that we've succeeded yet, but it is lacking. There's a big gap in terms of science policy dialogue and interface, and then an equally big gap between the science policy and the institutional and governance platforms. And in terms of things like climate finance, the institutional and governance arrangements are incredibly important. So linking, the science to the policy, to institutional, to finance becomes critical if developing countries are going to access climate finance in a meaningful way.
What is the difficulty in trying to link one with the other? What are the big obstacles you face?
I think one of the biggest obstacles is the language that scientists talk, which is very different to the language that policymakers talk. And I think a big challenge is getting, the science, the relevant science, focus on relevance, into a format that policymakers can absorb, which usually isn't a big, thick document. It's usually something short and sharp and snappy, which is not what scientists are typically producing. So a lot of it is not the only barrier, but a lot of it is a language accessibility of information.
I mean, it's certainly one of the frustrations we've noted here. We've been talking to a lot of scientists who say we have the solutions, we know the answers, but we can't get them implemented. I mean, they blame the politicians for that, but as you say, if it's a problem of language as well.
There is a problem with language as well. I mean, it depends on, where your question is coming from. From a negotiation standpoint, I would agree with what with that sentiment, that politicians are lacking the political will. But, I think that if politicians were given enough soundbite type information, it might help push the process along.
Right.
But that's from an international point of view. In terms of domestic policy, that becomes absolutely critical to get that science policy dialogue going.
Another avenue you mentioned was finance, which does seem to be an issue here in Cancun. Where the money comes from, how it's spent, is it spent in the right way, how accountable people are for the money that is being spent. How do you bridge all those many gaps?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one of the questions that you didn't raise now is that it's not only about how people are spending the money and the governance issues, it's also about having the capacity to absorb the money and to spend it on the right kind of projects. And, a lot of the debate that's going on around how much climate finance there needs to be, to us it doesn't matter as much as it matters that it's being spent on the right things. So developing countries are needing to get their institutional arrangements in place so that they can comply with the international requirements. And they also need to be very clear about what their priorities are. And I think the challenge with that often is that the international funds are looking for projects that are going to deal with the biggest risks around climate change. Whereas on a national level, countries still haven't got enough evaluation, particularly economic evaluation, at their fingertips to be able to justify that this project is a greater risk than that project, for example. So that's why the science policy dialogue becomes important, because scientists can give some of that information, but they also need to work in a multidisciplinary way, so that you've got your sort of climatologists or your sectoral-based scientists, biodiversity specialists or food security experts, also working in conjunction with economists, resource-based economists that are able to look at the impact of a particular adaptation or at the costs of doing that adaptation. Yeah.
I mean, having been the mood here in Cancun, I presume you were in Copenhagen last year, were you? I mean, what's the difference in the mood here in Cancun with just 2 days of the conference left to go? I mean, are you generally optimistic that there will be some move in the right direction?
Well, I'll comment first on the mood question. I think the mood's very different. People went to Copenhagen. There was a lot of hype and expectations were way too high. So the letdown when it came was, as you know, immense. What that's meant is that people have come here with much lower expectations, and they would have come lower anyway because the interim COP is always a smaller COP. My sense is that we're making good progress on a technical level, but so the technical discussions around, say, subsidy issues, even some of the climate finance discussions, which are talking about a new fund, I think there's good progress in some of those issues. But the overall progress in terms of the political will, every decision that we're busy looking at taking here in Cancun is linked directly to mitigation. And we're not going to get a commitment to mitigation targets in this event. So you kind of, the question then comes up as to what's going to become of these important technical progresses that we're making, given that the overall context is not in place. So I think the mood is not that optimistic, and there's a fair amount of frustration in our developing country partners. I've just come from the adaptation meeting, and they've been up since 2 o'clock, until 2 o'clock this morning, back at it since 7 o'clock, and just going around in circles on the same issues. And I think also places like Africa are putting their foot down and saying, compromise is fine, but not to the extent that it compromises our development and access to equity.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.